First, New Zealanders come
Order.
first.
The member's got a call for another call. Dr. David Clark.
Mr. Chair, thank you for the opportunity to speak to this bill and to speak about the international nature of the International Finance Amendment Bill in particular. That's where I want to put my attentions. And indeed, in the earlier stages of this bill, I raised the issue of international reputation and the way in which Maui dolphin were not being protected by New Zealand. This government was the only one in the world who did not propose greater protections for the Maui dolphin. Now, it's difficult to discuss this widely here, obviously, Mr. Chair, and I don't intend to, because that would be far too wide-ranging and you would draw me back into the substance of the bill. But suffice to say that international reputation matters, and it is important. That is one of the reasons why this legislation is very important. This legislation was debated earlier by Mr. Goldsmith, who confessed to being a little confused. His contribution attempted to debate some of the Labour positions on monetary policy, and I'm happy to set the record straight, but perhaps a little further into my speech, because I actually want to outline some of the important things that Labour supports in this bill to start with. Economic stability is really the aim of the IMF, and it is an important organisation, and it's important that New Zealand contributes to that aim for the good of the whole world, for the good of world trade, and for the betterment of all of the citizens of the world. If Parliament did nothing or disagreed with proposed changes to the Articles, the changes would nevertheless come into force for New Zealand with effect from the date that they entered into force for all IMF members. The result would be a confusing gap, essentially, between New Zealand legislation and our treaty obligations. We want to line up here deliberately in order to say we support this legislation. Labour is a responsible internationalist party that believes we should honour the international obligations and agreements that we have entered into, Mr. Chair. What we do oppose, though, is the changes that allow future updates to the Articles to be made by regulation. We think that subverting the normal parliamentary process is a tragedy. We think that this is the kind of thing that ought to come before this Parliament so that we can debate the merits of changing articles like this in future. We shouldn't delegate this down to Orders in Council. We need proper scrutiny, as my colleague says from behind, Mr. Andrew Little. And he's right. Mr. Andrew Little is right. Absolutely right. We need proper parliamentary scrutiny on these important measures. So while we have no difficulty with the actual substance of this particular change, we do feel uncomfortable with the changed process that allows that regulation-making power essentially to go into the hands of the executive in a power grab that bypasses the sovereignty of this Parliament and hides things in the background. Now, this process that we're going through here now is a transparent process. We're all debating it. We're debating the merits, and that is precisely what we lose when we do away with this process. And I guess the opposition are embarrassed when they hear scrutiny, the government, I should say. The government are embarrassed when they hear scrutiny being poured over many things. And I could go into Sky City deals, which are a talk today, and the report that's come out that suggests that indeed there was a lack of transparency and some unusual process, but we'll hear more of that, I'm sure, in the media, or the way in which they opposed asset sales changes in Select Committee, the way in which they tried to shut down debate because the scrutiny was uncomfortable. But parliamentary scrutiny is very, very important. It's a basic part of our job here as members of Parliament to make sure that laws are made well and are debated properly and are made with full information. And how can anyone, I ask, Mr. Chair, oppose that? Why is the government opposing this scrutiny in future? It doesn't feel right to me. I want to ask also, Mr. Chair, why this bill has taken so long to appear in Parliament. Australia passed equivalent legislation in September 2009 and November 2010. This is another example of the government incapable of managing the parliamentary agenda and you know, perhaps incapable. Mr. Mallard corrects me, and perhaps this is why we see them in future wishing to push this away from the Parliament so they have less to manage. I don't think that's a legitimate reason, Mr Chair. I don't think that is a legitimate reason for pushing this out of scrutiny, out of the eyes of the scrutiny of this Parliament. Now, what we also see, and one begins to wonder whether this is important to the government, because it is concerned that we may need IMF intervention here. Look, when we see the books, we don't think seriously that this is the case, but you do start to wonder, Mr Chair. You might not wonder, Mr Chair, but I certainly do, as to whether things are worse behind the scenes than we're really seeing. Now, what we see, though, clearly is that under the last Labor government, we had a 25% growth in real GDP. Now, that was great performance. Under this government, real wages have dropped, and that is concerning. And so what is going on when the IMF is projecting for New Zealand the worst current account deficit in the world this year, in the developed world? What is going on there with New Zealand? And I have a real concern, Mr Chair, that this government behind the scenes is saying we need to line up, we need to tick all the boxes with the IMF, because one day soon we might need them. And if what we saw from Mr Goldsmith, the confusion around economic policy, is anything to go by, that need might come sooner rather than later, since he is understood to be one of the promising economic minds. He said in his contribution that he didn't understand the need for macroprudential powers to be given to the Reserve Bank so that they might look at issues other than simply inflation when they go about their business. To that I could add a range of other things that could be done were the government a little more focused on the economy. You know, we need pro-growth tax reform. We need a capital gains tax to neutralise the investment signal. We need research and development tax credits. We need greater KiwiSaver, universal KiwiSaver, so that we've actually got savings to invest in business. And we need procurement policies that are pro-New Zealand rather than in favour of multinationals who are avoiding tax in New Zealand. So we know that the purposes of the IMF in supplying its loans are to help member countries tackle balance of payment problems. Well, we wonder, if that's their first objective, maybe that is why the government is cozying up to them, because New Zealand certainly has a balance of payment problems that this government hasn't even started to address. The IMF loans are meant to help member countries stabilise their economies. Well, we've seen an economy that is not performing here in New Zealand. In fact, this government has the worst economic record of any government in New Zealand in the last 50 years. That is amazing. It's not good. It's outrageous. So stabilising economies is something the IMF does. And the IMF loans are also meant to help restore sustainable economic growth. Now, all of these things are things that this government is failing on. So perhaps the real reason that this government is cozying up to the IMF, that is agreeing to pass things outside the normal parliamentary process for future changes, is because they are wanting to get cosy to the IMF in case one day Paul Goldsmith becomes the finance minister. Members behind me say it will never happen, but we thought this government promised a brighter future, and we've seen 17,000 jobs go last year in the manufacturing sector. So we're seeing promises on the one hand and a government that is failing to address the balance of payments problems, failing to stabilise the economy and failing to restore sustainable economic growth. Those very objectives that the IMF loans are meant to help member countries tackle.
Brendan Horn, just before the member speaks, I note the member has an amendment. That's to clause 2. We're in clause 1, which is permits a slightly wider scope than just title and some general comments. So the member, of course, is entitled to a call. I'm trying to assist him. If you want to make some substantial comments about your SOP, clause 2 is the place to make that. Brendan Horan. Yeah,